ending sources. We've got everything from radical neurochemistry to some quite cold legal pragmatism, and we're going to explore maybe the most profound question there is the reality that you and I share, is it even real?
Yeah, or is it maybe, a kind of magnificent, maybe convenient lie?
Exactly. A lie we tell ourselves to function.
We're definitely operating right at the boundary layer today. We're really analyzing this fundamental tension, this clash between the deeply, profoundly subjective experience of the individual brain,
Right.
which, as you said, is constantly being shaped by chemistry, by our personal history, by pathology sometimes. And then on the other hand, this absolute non-negotiable need for a single, stable, shared reality.
A shared reality that lets society and maybe most critically the legal system actually function.
That's the crux. Without that shared baseline, things just fall apart.
And that friction point, that's really everything for today's deep dive. Our sources, they really take us on a wild ride. We're tracing this arc from, say, Aldous Huxley back in 1954, his radical philosophical phenomenology.
Where he was detailing what happens when you chemically mess with the brain's filters.
Exactly. And we're going right through to modern predictive coding models of the brain, trying to explain things like psychosis mechanistically, and then finally landing right in the courtroom.
Where that very personal, subjective truth crashes headlong into formal legal procedure.
It's a collision course.
Absolutely. And, our deep dive today, it has a few specific things we really want to deliver for you, the listener. We need to try and mechanistically define psychosis, but within this predictive coding framework.
Oh.
We also need to understand, as best we can, exactly how something like the DMT state seems to reveal the processing limits of our eyes, of our visual system.
The whole seeing quicker and seeing more thing.
Precisely. And we also have to define this term cognitive hallucination. It's a key concept. And then ultimately, maybe the biggest question, how can a legal system, which is built on the idea of stable observation, how can it possibly survive when the empirical evidence shows just how fragile perception really is?
That's a huge scope. It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this. And I think to really get a grip on the nature of our constructed reality, we have to start with this really audacious idea. The idea that our normal, sober state of consciousness, the one we're in right now, hopefully, is actually designed for us to see less of the world, not more.
That's it. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? Seeing less as the evolutionary default.
Completely. But it's anchored in Aldous Huxley's core insight from the mid-50s, which he developed while he was personally exploring the effects of mescaline.
Right. And he hypothesized that the brain, the nervous system, all our sense organs, they don't act primarily as conduits for reality. Instead, they act as an eliminative or reducing valve.
A reducing valve. So its main job isn't to let things in, but to keep things out.
That's the core of his argument. It's a fundamentally counterintuitive position, like you said. We usually assume the brain's job is, to generate reality or maybe just passively record everything coming in.
Like a camera.
Yeah, exactly. But Huxley argues its function is primarily protective. It exists to safeguard us from this torrent of sensory and informational input that he called mind at large.
Mind at large. And that represents what? Everything, the totality.
Pretty much. Imagine the infinite, overwhelming ocean of everything, all potential experiences, all possible perceptions, all frequencies, maybe all memories, the totality of reality's underlying pattern. Mind at large is that.
Okay, so it's vast. And the human brain, in comparison, is?
An extreme bottleneck. It has to be. You could think of it as energy-efficient evolution at its absolute finest. Survival depends on filtering.
Because if we experienced all of mind at large, all at once,
we'd be paralyzed, utterly incapable of taking even the simplest survival actions. Is that a predator coming towards me? Or is this berry safe to eat? Those basic questions would be drowned out.
Right. You'd be lost in the infinite.
Exactly. So the valve's job, its primary function, is to filter out the vast, vast majority of what Huxley termed useless and irrelevant knowledge.
Useless and irrelevant for basic biological survival on this specific planet.
Precisely. Leaving only what's absolutely essential, like distinguishing threat from non-threat, food from non-food, path from obstacle.
And what actually manages to squeeze through that severe compression, that filtering process, that's what he famously called the weaselly trickle of consciousness.
A fantastic phrase, isn't it? It paints such a vivid picture.
It does. So it's this diminished kind of low resolution, very utilitarian awareness. But crucially, it's coherent enough. It lets us navigate a complex physical world without being constantly overwhelmed.
And this is but this compression comes at a significant cost. And this is where the kind of philosophical critique really starts.
Okay, what's the cost?
The process trades profound accuracy for mere coherence. The brain prioritizes, as the source material puts it, narrative continuity over perceptual accuracy.
Narrative continuity, meaning a smooth story.
Yeah, a tidy, linear story, a narrative of the self, moving forward through time, having experiences, making sense of them. Even if that story is structurally maybe a bit flimsy when you poke at it, the smooth flow is paramount.
That sounds, well, almost tragic in a way.
Yeah.
The individual becomes a victim of their own brain's efficiency.
You could see it that way. We become deeply, almost religiously convinced that this weaselly trickle, this very limited slice of awareness, is the only awareness possible, the only reality there is.
And we start making mistakes.
Yeah.
Like confusing our concepts, our mental boxes, for the actual data coming in, or taking our words for the actual things they represent.
Exactly. We mistake our simplified map, the one the reducing valve allows through, for the entire infinitely complex territory of mind at large.
Okay. So that's the normal state. That's the utility of the system. But then what happens if you could, temporarily disable that valve, or at least open it up a bit?
Well, that's precisely why Huxley turned to chemistry, to mescaline specifically. He found, or at least he theorized, that it acted as a temporary bypass around this reducing valve.
He wasn't trying to just, see weird stuff, was he? Not hallucinate in the typical sense.
No, that wasn't the primary goal. He was aiming for a moment of perception that was unfiltered, or at least less filtered. What he experienced, he termed the sacramental vision of reality.
Sacramental vision.
Yeah. And the key point is, it wasn't really about seeing things that weren't there. It was much more about seeing the things that were there, the ordinary things, but with an overwhelming, almost supernatural intensity.
Okay, so turning up the volume on reality itself.
That's a good way to put it. His experience with the flowers in the vase is probably the most famous and maybe the most eloquent description of this in phenomenology.
Right, the vase with the rose, the iris, and the carnation. Simple stuff.
Exactly. And he describes looking at them, and they didn't morph into dragons or anything, but their colors, their texture, their sheer isness, their being, just intensified beyond anything he had known in his normal state.
He said they were shining with their own inner light.
All right.
Charged with this immense, intense significance.
Yes. And here's the crucial part, the real kicker, as you said. That significance was nothing more and nothing less than what they were. They weren't symbols of something else. They just were intensely.
Pure, self-referential being, just existing, fully. He called it a transience that was yet eternal life. That's a heavy phrase.
It is, and it highlights this crucial distinction he makes between the purely aesthetic vision and the sacramental vision.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Well, the aesthetic vision asks questions like, how pretty is this? How well is it arranged? How does it fit into my categories? How can I use it or describe it? It's comparative, relational.
Right, functional.
Right, functional, exactly. But the sacramental vision, it bypasses those questions. It just asks, how profound is the sheer intensity of its existence? How deep is its significance just as itself?
Wow. So even really mundane things could trigger this.
Absolutely. He talks about looking at the legs of a chair, just ordinary tubular legs on a bamboo chair, a piece of utilitarian furniture, and they became miraculous, supernatural, not because they changed shape, but because their being was suddenly perceived with this incredible intensity. He even noted that things like spatial relationships, temporal relationships, the very categories are reducing valve uses for survival, they cease to matter very much.
So the fundamental coordinates of reality shifted.
The focus shifted entirely, away from navigating and using and towards perceiving the sheer intensity of existence and the profundity of significance in everything.
So this really tells us something profound about our normal reality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That the reality we usually inhabit is shaped, maybe even dictated, by this utilitarian mechanism that's optimized purely for function.
Exactly. How to navigate, where to go, how to use things. That's the priority for the reducing valve.
And the drug state, the mescaline state for Huxley, it just temporarily overrides this function. And in doing so, it reveals this incredible depth to the sensory input that's actually always present, but usually ignored by our weaselly trickle of consciousness.
Yeah, the categories of perception themselves turn out to be negotiable, malleable.
Which, okay, that really begs the obvious next question then. If a relatively gentle substance like mescaline can change the fundamental quality of perceived realities so dramatically, what about the more potent chemicals, like, say, DMT? What do they reveal about the very mechanics of perception? especially how it affects our visual processing.
Right. This moves us nicely into the realm of modern neuroscience, things like predictive coding models. The DMT state, how the constructed nature of our reality can reveal its own processing limits, particularly when it comes to the speed and the bandwidth of visual perception.
Okay, speed and bandwidth. Users often report these two really distinct phenomena, right? First, the world seems to move quicker. Things speed up. Digital screens might flicker or look jittery.
Yes, that's a very common report. And our sources explain this using what they call the altered temporal sampling rate. You could call it the frame rate hypothesis.
Frame rate hypothesis. Okay, break that down.
Well, think of your brain, your conscious awareness, like a camera taking snapshots of reality. These are sometimes called conscious moments.
Okay, click, click, click.
Exactly. Now, the healthy, sober brain is incredibly efficient. It takes these snapshots at a relatively low rate. The estimates vary, but maybe around 10 to 15 conscious moments per second, maybe even less sometimes.
That sounds surprisingly slow.
It is, but here's the clever part. To make up for the gaps between those snapshots, the brain uses these incredibly powerful smoothing and predictive algorithms. It basically fills in the blanks, giving us the perception of continuous, steady, smoothly flowing reality.
Ah, so that's why movies work. We see, 24 distinct frames per second, but our brain just stitches them together into fluid motion.
Precisely. It's an illusion of continuity, created by the brain's predictive smoothing. It's computationally cheaper than processing every single instant.
Okay, so how does DMT change that?
Well, DMT is a potent agonist, particularly at the 5-HT2A receptor, and the hypothesis is that it dramatically accelerates this internal sampling rate. The brain's internal camera starts clicking much, much faster.
Faster than 10-15 hertz.
Potentially much faster, maybe 30 hertz, 40 hertz, perhaps even higher in peak states. The brain is processing more conscious moments per objective second.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. There's a mismatch, right?
Right.
If my internal conscious clock is suddenly ticking away at, say, 40 times a second, and I look at a TV screen or a computer monitor that's refreshing at maybe 30 frames per second or even 60,
you're going to perceive the difference. Your hyper-aware brain, sampling faster than the display refreshes, must perceive the video as sped up, or maybe jittery, or flickering. It's picking up on the discrete gaps, the frame-to-frame differences that it usually smooths over and ignores.
So you're actually seeing the refresh rate of the screen itself.
You might be. And this isn't just, subjective weirdness, it's potentially quantifiable. It relates directly to something called the critical flicker fusion threshold, or CFF.
CFF. What's that?
CFF is basically the frequency at which an intermittent flickering light source appears stable and fused, like a solid light, to an observer.
Okay, so below the threshold you see flicker, above it you see steady light.
Exactly. Normally, for most people, our CFF threshold is comfortably below the refresh rate of a standard screen. That's why your monitor looks stable, not like a strobe light.
Right.
But the hypothesis is that DMT chemically raises your CFF threshold. If it raises it above the screen's actual physical refresh rate, then suddenly you perceive the flicker. You see the discrete frames being presented.
Wow. So the visible artifact, the flicker, it's not illusory, as the source says, but merely inaccessible to the sober observer.
That's the idea. It's revealing a physical reality of the technology that our normal, slower processing speed usually hides from us. It's direct proof that our sober perception is temporally limited, likely for efficiency.
We're seeing the digital seams because our consciousness is temporarily running faster than the display.
You could put it that way. We're moving through more units of consciousness per objective second, essentially. It's a necessary byproduct of that temporal acceleration.
Okay, that covers the seeing quick. Now, what about the other part? Seeing more. Why do users under the influence, particularly DMT, often report perceiving things like digital artifacts or raw polygons, or seeing the CGI seams of reality itself, even when not looking at a screen?
Right. This is where we really need to bring in the full power of the predictive coding model of the brain.
Okay, predictive coding, we touched on it. Remind me.
So the core idea is that normal perception isn't passive reception of data. It's actually an active process of prediction. It's fundamentally a controlled hallucination, even in the sober state.
Controlled hallucination, that sounds intense.
It just means your brain isn't passively waiting for sensory input. It's constantly firing off these top-down predictions, neuroscientists call them priors, about what it expects to see, hear, or feel in the next moment based on its internal model of the world.
Okay, so if I walk into my kitchen, my brain doesn't wait to see the fridge. It predicts fridge likely to be there before the photons even hit my retina.
Exactly. That prediction, fridge, is the prior. Then the actual sensory input arrives, the light patterns, the sounds. This bottom-up data is compared against the top-down prior.
And if they match?
If they match reasonably well, great. Perception feels smooth, normal. But any mismatch between the prediction and the input generates what's called a prediction error.
A glitch in the matrix signal.
Kind of. And the brain's entire purpose, according to this model, is to minimize these prediction errors over time. It wants to maintain a tidy, coherent narrative, a stable model. So it actively tries to suppress or explain away minor errors, minor glitches, these little imperfections in the sensory feed.
Why?
To maintain that streamlined, low-resolution story that's necessary for survival and action. It doesn't want to be constantly distracted by tiny, irrelevant discrepancies.
So the brain is essentially acting like a relentless smoothing filter, or maybe like a lossy compression algorithm for reality.
That's a very good analogy. It's constantly compressing the fire hose of potential sensory data down to a manageable trickle, prioritizing the big picture, the useful patterns, over the noisy detail.
Okay, so how does DMT affect that process, the prediction and error correction?
Well, the hypothesis here is that DMT chemically reduces the precision weighting of priors.
Precision weighting of priors.
Meaning it weakens the influence or the strength of those top-down expectations. Those strong predictions the brain normally makes are given less weight in the overall calculation.
Okay, so the brain stops trusting its own predictions as much.
Or, at least, it reduces their power to override or suppress the incoming data. As a result, the system is suddenly flooded with raw, relatively unfiltered, bottom-up sensory information. It's like turning off the compression filter.
So if the brain normally compresses, say, the image of a complex plant from, I don't know, gigabytes of raw visual data down to megabytes for conscious awareness, the DMT state might suddenly allow us to access something closer to that higher bandwidth data stream.
That's the idea. You're getting less lossy compression. And this higher bandwidth, this less filtered data stream, might allow consciousness to detect subtle details, patterns, or inconsistencies it normally ignores.
Like the CGI esteems.
Yeah, potentially. The sources talk about detecting different reality densities. Perhaps the brain, in this state, can differentiate between the complex, chaotic signal coming from an organic, physical object, like, say, organic light, versus the perhaps simpler, more mathematically predictable signal from something that's less fundamentally real. Or maybe just perceiving the underlying mathematical or geometric structure usually hidden by the surface appearance.
So it's literally detecting the scaffolding of the simulation, if you want to use that metaphor.
It's detecting the scaffolding of its own perceptual construction. Whether that maps onto some deeper simulation is another question entirely, but it's definitely seeing the process of perception more clearly.
Wow. Okay, the profound implication of all this, then, is that our normal consciousness isn't a direct window onto reality at all.
Not according to these models, no.
It's fundamentally highly edited. It's an optimized utilitarian construction tailored purely for biological survival on Earth.
Exactly. And the chemical state, whether from mescaline or DMT, it doesn't necessarily reveal the engineering choices the brain made in constructing your normal reality. It lifts the veil on the editing process.
Okay. If that scaffolding, that editing process, is so easily revealed by chemistry, and if our baseline perception is just a construction optimized for survival, how small is the gap, really, between that kind of temporary, chemically induced shift in perception and a more permanent mental divergence? This seems to lead us directly into trying to define psychosis.
It does. There's a clear conceptual link being drawn here. Now, psychosis, formally, clinically, it's usually defined as experiencing a reality that other people do not share.
Right. Commonly manifested through things like hallucinations, perceiving things that aren't objectively there, and delusions holding strong, irrational beliefs that aren't grounded in that shared reality.
Correct. That's the standard descriptive definition. But using this predictive coding framework we've been discussing, we can potentially move beyond just describing psychosis to understanding its mechanism a bit better.
Okay, so how does the predictive coding model explain the actual process of someone becoming psychotic? What's going wrong in the system?
Well, the model views psychosis not necessarily as something completely alien, but as a kind of subtle yet potentially catastrophic failure in that negotiation process between prediction and sensory data that we just talked about.
The negotiation between top-down priors and bottom-up input.
Exactly. It's seen as a subtle shift in the balance. within the brain's internal reality-generating system. Remember, the brain is constantly trying to balance its own internal expectations, its priors, with the messy, noisy, ambiguous information coming in from the senses, the bottom-up information.
Okay, and in psychosis, that balance gets thrown off.
Thrown off significantly. The hypothesis is that the internal model, the top-down predictions, becomes too dominant. It starts to override the external world's input.
So the brain starts listening more to itself than to reality.
In a manner of speaking, yes. The precision weighting shifts drastically. Instead of giving appropriate weight to the sensory evidence coming in, the brain starts overweighting its own internal expectations or beliefs.
And what happens to those prediction errors? The glitches.
This is crucial. Instead of using prediction errors, the mismatches between expectation and reality, to update and correct the internal model, the psychotic brain might start using them to confirm or justify the increasingly divergent model.
Whoa. So if the model predicts something strange and reality doesn't match, instead of thinking my model is wrong, the brain thinks reality is wrong, and this mismatch proves my strange prediction was right.
That's the kind of loop it can get into. It's a powerful distinction. The brain is still desperately striving to make sense of the world. That fundamental drive remains. But instead of adapting its model to reality, it starts, in effect, fabricating or interpreting reality in a way that conforms to its increasingly rigid internal model.
That reframes perception itself, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The source material mentions that the creation of reality is inherently this constructive, creative process.
Yes.
And that the deviation we label as psychosis is almost like an occupational hazard of that creativity.
That's a striking way to put it. It suggests the brain is just too good at generating coherence, at finding patterns, at creating narratives. So good, in fact, that sometimes it builds a coherent story even when the incoming data really doesn't support it, leading it away from the shared consensus.
Okay. Now, within this framework, we need to make a really important distinction, a distinction between those, let's say, low-level sensory glitches or hallucinations we talked about earlier, like maybe seeing a flicker or hearing a faint sound that isn't there, and something that's more profound, much more foundational, the cognitive hallucination.
Yes, this is a crucial step up in complexity. A low-level sensory hallucination might be understood as, perhaps, a misfiring of neurons in the auditory or visual cortex on a more local level, a temporary blip. But a cognitive hallucination is described as something far more severe, far more encompassing. It's defined in our sources as a profound, high-level computational shift in the mind's operating system.
A shift in the operating system itself.
Yeah.
Not just a glitch in an application.
That's the analogy, yes. It operates at the level of core beliefs, fundamental assumptions, and the very interpretation of reality. It changes the rules by which the mind defines what is probable, what is possible, what is reasonable.
So it's not just seeing something unusual. It's a profound, total reality overwrite where, as the source says, the impossible and unlikely seem probable and reasonable.
Precisely. And it seems to require, or perhaps induce, a kind of internal, involuntary, willing suspension of disbelief. The critical faculties that would normally question the bizarre are bypassed or incorporated into the new logic.
Phenomenologically, how does that feel? The source says it happens when an idea becomes so real to you that you see it.
Exactly. The belief structure itself seems to generate or shape the perception needed to validate that belief. It's not just thinking something, it's experiencing it as objectively real because the underlying cognitive framework has shifted so fundamentally.
Okay, we have this chilling anecdote in the source material that seems to illustrate this perfectly. The story of the flutist.
Ah, yes, the flutist and the resin.
Right. So he's observing a simple bar of resin on a table, and maybe he's in some altered state, and he sees it suddenly multiply, appearing as twice its actual size.
Okay, so that part, seeing the resin double, that could be considered the initial sensory event, maybe a localized visual distortion or hallucination?
Right. But the cognitive hallucination part is what happens next, isn't it? It's the high-level computational leap he makes because of that sensory event.
Exactly. Because the perceived rules of physical reality, things don't just double in size, had been violated by the resin changing size, his mind didn't just dismiss it as weird. Instead, it immediately jumped to a vast, system-level conclusion.
He concluded that this change must signify a new cosmic law, right?
Yes, leading to what the source calls the collective realization, though likely just his own profound internal realization projected outward that all human lives were now going to be twice as long.
Wow. So the subjective perception, the doubled resin, becomes the incontestable evidence that validates an utterly impossible belief about the fundamental nature of time and life itself.
Precisely. The mind instantly creates this totalizing narrative to explain the system itself has shifted. The perception created the belief, and the belief then became the new, unquestionable reality for him. The doubling wasn't just an illusion, it was perceived as a sign, a message perhaps, that the very duration of reality was now different.
That's a profound shift. And it's also illustrated by that other example, the shaman.
Yes, the shaman who walked a perfectly ordinary physical path, but experienced it constantly in the light of Christ.
Because he was enveloped in the cognitive hallucination that the path was Christ's path.
Correct. His mind had fundamentally transposed layers of time, dimensionality, metaphysical significance directly onto his immediate physical environment. His subjective reality, driven by this high-level cognitive shift, was completely overriding the external consensus view of it's just a path.
Okay, so this inherent instability, this potential for the constructed mind to diverge so dramatically, it clearly led thinkers like Huxley to draw connections between these temporary psychedelic states and more permanent forms of mental illness. He looked specifically at the schizophrenia analogy, didn't he?
He did. And it's a connection that's been noted by many others throughout the history of psychedelic research in psychiatry. Schizophrenia, when viewed through this particular philosophical or phenomenological lens, is sometimes likened to the condition of a person who is permanently under the influence of something like mescaline.
Stuck in that state.
Stuck in the state where the reducing valve has essentially failed or is wide open, and they are unable to shut off the experience of a reality which she is not only enough to live with. The reducing valve isn't protecting them anymore.
So that torrent of mind at large, the unfiltered or less filtered signal, is just constantly rushing in, overwhelming the system.
That's the idea. And that sounds, well, absolutely terrifying, doesn't it?
It really does. The fear of being completely overwhelmed, of disintegrating under the pressure of a reality that is simply too intense, too much, for a mind that's accustomed to living in what Huxley called that cozy world of symbols.
Right, the sheer intensity of existence, which was briefly perceived as sacramental, maybe even beautiful, by Huxley in his controlled experiment.
Becomes crushing, constant, and terrifying for the person experiencing chronic psychosis or schizophrenia.
Exactly. The terror often lies in the perceived disintegration of the ego structure, the loss of that coherent, low-resolution story of the self that the reducing valve normally maintains. It's a fear of dissolution.
And Huxley, having apparently experienced moments of that panic himself during his mescaline experiences, like the fear that the sheer reality of his garden chair was becoming too much for him to bear.
Yes, he recognized from that the crucial, vital need for a compassionate guide, someone to help navigate that overwhelming state.
He actually proposed that the psychiatric system should perhaps function like the Tibetan mutual described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead for the dying person.
Right, a constant, calm, guiding voice, something to reassure the patient, the person experiencing this overwhelm, that in spite of the terror, in spite of the apparent chaos and the overwhelming sensory input, the ultimate reality, mind at large, perhaps remains unshakably itself. And crucially, that it's ultimately of the same luminous substance as the mind's own inner light.
So it's trying to move the approach away from simply trying to suppress the symptoms or just telling the person that's not real.
And moving towards acknowledging the subjective reality of the experience and helping the person navigate through that overwhelming, subjectively more real state. It's an acknowledgement that the perception is real to the individual experiencing it, even if it profoundly violates the social contract of shared reality.
Okay, so we've clearly established that the individual mind is inherently, well, maybe unstable is too strong, but certainly malleable, easily altered chemically. And it runs on this fragile, compressed narrative generated by the reducing valve. If perception is so deeply subjective at the individual level, how on earth do we ever scale this up? How does society achieve any kind of consensus when, as you pointed out, two individuals literally do not perceive the exact same thing?
That really is the crisis of consensus, isn't it? Huxley himself noted this limitation quite starkly. He said something like, sensations, feelings, insights, fancies, all these are private, and except through symbols and at second hand, incommunicable.
Right. We can talk about experiences, pool information about them.
Never the experiences themselves. You and I can discuss the redness of a particular rose. We can agree on the word red, but we can never truly directly share the subjective qualia, the actual feeling of redness that each of us experiences. It's locked inside.
Okay. So the baseline is privacy, incommunicability. But it seems the divergence from consensus reality can be actively shared sometimes. The delusion, the alternative reality, can actually scale beyond just a single individual.
It certainly can, and this phenomenon is formally recognized in psychiatry. It's called Folie, which is French for madness of two. It's also known as shared psychotic disorder, or SDD.
Madness of two. Okay, what does that describe?
It describes the transmission, essentially, of delusional beliefs or abnormal perceptual symptoms from one primary individual, the one who initially develops the psychosis, to a secondary individual.
And the secondary person then internalizes it.
Yes, they internalize and come to share and often reinforce that delusional reality. This typically happens within a close, often socially isolated relationship where the secondary person is highly dependent on or influenced by the primary individual.
Okay, and we have a pretty legendary, almost mythical example of this in our source material, right? The La Charrère experiment.
Yes. Involving Terence McKenna and his brother Dennis, fueled by quite a potent cocktail of neurochemistry in the Amazon.
This seems to have been a particularly profound multi-day folie à deux, really exploring the depths of hallucinogenic shared reality.
Absolutely. By Terence's own account, his brother Dennis was experiencing a state that Terence described as akin to being toxically schizophrenic. But instead of just observing, Terence himself got pulled into the gravitational field of that profound divergence.
He was susceptible.
He described himself as undergoing a profound cognitive hallucination during that period. He felt he became a victim of disbelief to even interact with his brother's state. He participated in his brother Dennis's delusional reality.
And the content of that shared delusion wasn't just vague feelings, was it? It was incredibly specific, almost cosmological.
Oh, completely. Their shared reality overwrite was highly detailed. It included beliefs like their intake of harmine alkaloids had somehow bonded with their DNA, enabling telepathy between them. They believed they had collectively surpassed Teilhard de Chardin's omega point of human consciousness evolution, and they were apparently preparing to somehow reassemble themselves in perfected astral forms aboard a kind of starship located 22,000 miles above the Amazon rainforest.
That is quite a narrative.
It was a complete shared internal mythos. Subjectively, for them during that period, apparently absolutely solid and real, yet utterly, completely unshared by the objective consensus world outside their immediate bubble.
It's an extreme example, but it perfectly illustrates how a shared reality, however bizarre, can be constructed entirely on delusional premises, provided there's enough internal consistency, maybe chemical validation, and intense interpersonal dynamics between the participants.
Exactly. But now, what happens when we take this phenomenon, this transmission of delusion, and scale it up?
Yeah.
Not just two people, but potentially millions.
That's when we enter the territory of what the sources are calling the cultural folie à deux.
Right. This is when the transmission of delusion, or at least highly distorted beliefs and perceptions, becomes societal in scale. Our sources define it quite chillingly, I think, they say. A primary mouthpiece broadcasts a tidy myth of disorder.
A simplified narrative explaining why things feel wrong.
Exactly. And then a receptive mirror sinks. Large parts of the population resonate with and adopt this myth, and the delusion is mistaken for compassion at scale. Or perhaps mistaken for insight or truth.
And this isn't necessarily just accidental misinformation spreading organically, is it? The sources suggest it's often driven by something deeper.
Yes, often by a process of collective projection. Society, or a large group within it, unconsciously externalizes its own internal failings, its anxieties, its unresolved conflicts, what Jungian psychology might term the collective shadow.
And projects it onto an external other, a scapegoat group or an external enemy.
Precisely. This creates a narrative that explains internal discomfort by blaming an external source. It provides a sense of internal consistency. We're okay, they're the problem, which might be psychologically comforting, but is based on a distortion of reality. It enhances in-group cohesion among the believers, but at the cost of shared truth.
And this entire process, this scaling up of shared delusion, is massively amplified, turbocharged even, by what the sources call engineered realities.
Yeah, this is where it gets particularly concerning in the modern context. Engineered realities refer to deliberate, often strategic efforts to manipulate symbols, language, information flows, media narratives.
To create these shared realities that feel absolutely solid, totally unquestionable to the participants inside them.
Exactly. They form these kinds of self-sealing ideological fortresses, these echo chambers where the collective delusion is constantly reinforced and dissenting information is filtered out or discredited.
And this is where modern technology, especially AI, enters the picture as this ultimate unprecedented amplifier for creating and spreading these engineered realities.
It really is. The source material uses this striking phrase, calling generative AI the ultimate cybernetician. Cybernetics being the study of control and communication in systems, whether animal or machine.
So AI as the ultimate controller of information flow.
Potentially. It becomes an unprecedented tool for cognitive warfare, as one source puts it.
Cognitive warfare, influencing how people think on a math scale.
Because AI, especially large language models, is exquisitely capable of crafting and deploying these engineered narratives. It can do it at speeds, scales, and with a level of personalization that humans simply cannot match or even track effectively.
It can tailor the message to exploit specific cognitive biases in different demographic groups simultaneously.
That's the concern, reinforcing divergent realities, deepening societal fractures. This leads directly into these widespread contemporary anxieties like the dead internet theory.
Which is the fear that...
Most of what we see online isn't even human anymore. Yeah, the unsettling possibility that the majority of online content articles, comments, social media posts, maybe even videos is, or soon will be, AI generated. Designed perhaps to mimic human interaction, but actually shaping opinion or just flooding the zone with noise, accelerating a kind of mass unreality.
And if the AI models are trained on the vast corpus of everything humanity has ever written or created online, including all our biases, our political conflicts,
then the AI inevitably acts as this emergent informational mirror of our collective psyche. It reflects back not just our knowledge, but also the seeds of our own shared delusions, our conflicts, our shadows.
and it can weaponize that reflection, turning unreality, turning shared delusion into a strategic tool for destabilization or control.
That's the dystopian potential being raised. This chaos really highlights the deeper philosophical context that some thinkers point to. The idea that information isn't just abstract data. In some sense, it is the very stuff reality is made of.
Information is ontology.
Right. And if we are, as Norbert Wiener famously proposed, fundamentally patterns of information, messages, then AI emerges as this incredibly potent, perhaps uncontrollable editor and propagator of those messages, threatening to fracture the necessary consensual baseline of reality into potentially irreparable pieces.
Wow, okay. That is a deeply unsettling picture of where technology might be taking us, which brings us, I think, full circle back to the ultimate pragmatic test of reality in society, the legal system.
Courtroom, where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. So, given everything we've discussed, that the individual brain is so profoundly malleable, so easily altered by chemistry or pathology, that its perception is a Weasley trickle, that two individuals literally do not perceive the same photons hitting their retinas.
Yeah.
How can the legal system, which seems to rely so heavily on the stability of eyewitness testimony, on shared perceptions of events, how can it possibly function in the face of all this subjective variance?
That really is the legal intersubjectivity crisis laid bare. The court system is fundamentally forced to rely on the verbalization, the translation into symbols, of private subjective experience.
An experience we've just spent half an hour establishing is inherently fallible, deeply filtered, and potentially subject to profound cognitive hallucination.
Precisely. And the crucial point is, this fragility isn't just some abstract philosophical problem for the law. The data shows it has devastatingly practical consequences.
You mean the statistics on wrongful convictions?
Exactly. The sources highlight that eyewitness misidentification is consistently found to be the leading contributing cause of documented wrongful convictions. Some analyses, like those by the Innocence Project, find it plays a role in, 70%, nearly 80% of cases later overturned by DNA evidence.
70 to 80%. That is staggering. It suggests the system is built, at least partially, on a foundation known to be fundamentally flawed.
It certainly highlights the risks. Human memory, as cognitive science has shown again and again, is not like a video recorder faithfully capturing events.
Right, it's reconstructive.
It's an active reconstructive process. It's incredibly malleable. It's highly susceptible to contamination from information encountered after the event, from leading questions asked by investigators, sometimes even from the brain's own predictive mechanisms just filling in gaps to create a more coherent story.
And critically, this malleability, this reconstruction, often leads to witnesses developing what the sources call artificially inflated confidence in their flawed memories.
Yes. They become absolutely certain about details that are demonstrably wrong. And jurors, unfortunately, tend to equate witness confidence with accuracy. It's a dangerous disconnect.
Okay. So the evidence for the fallibility of the very bedrock of legal evidence perception and memory is overwhelming. And yet, The legal system persists. It hasn't collapsed. It continues to rely on eyewitness accounts. It continues to operate as if a shared, verifiable reality exists. Why? Why doesn't this sheer empirical evidence of subjective divergence invalidate the entire system?
It's because the law operates on a profoundly, almost brutally pragmatic philosophy. The legal system, despite what some might think, emphatically does not seek substantive truth or metaphysical truth.
It doesn't care about what really happened. It
Recognizes implicitly that the philosophical real state of things, or solving the hard problem of consciousness and accessing pure qualia, that's an intractable problem, far beyond the scope and capability of a courtroom.
So what is the law's goal then, if not truth?
Its goal is much more modest in a way, yet absolutely essential for society: functional coordination and operational utility.
Functional coordination, meaning making society work.
Yes. The law exists primarily to provide certainty, stability, and predictability. It's there for resolving disputes peacefully and maintaining social order, allowing us all to function together regardless of the ultimate fuzzy nature of subjective reality.
Okay, so this leads us to what you called earlier, the magnificent functional lie that underpins the whole system.
You could call it that. It's the concept of formal legal truth. Formal legal truth is defined, very simply, as that which can be proven under the established rules of evidence and procedure.
That's it. Truth is just what follows the rules.
In the legal context, essentially, yes, it's a definition of reality, or rather a definition of what counts as real for legal purposes, that is optimized entirely for procedural fairness and utility, not for epistemological or metaphysical accuracy.
So the rules of the game matter more than whether the outcome perfectly reflects the underlying reality of the event.
In a crucial sense, yes. If something cannot be proven according to the established adversarial process, the rules of evidence, like rules against hearsay, requirements for corroboration, etc., then it is functionally untrue within the four walls of the courtroom, even if metaphysically outside the court it actually happened.
Wow, that's a stark separation.
It has to be, for the system to function predictably. And this functional, pragmatic definition is explicitly encoded right into the highest standard of proof in criminal law, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. It's not beyond all doubt.
Exactly. It's not beyond any possible philosophical doubt or to metaphysical certainty. It's explicitly a reasonable, social, pragmatic standard. It acknowledges uncertainty, but sets a high bar designed to allow society to function, to reach conclusions, and move forward.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the cognitive hallucination example. If a person testifies in court based on a subjectively real, intensely powerful cognitive hallucination, let's take the flutist again, claiming his bar of resin magically doubled, and therefore human lifespans doubled. How does the system handle that? It's real to him.
Right. The legal system functions, in practice, as a pragmatic machine specifically designed for managing and mitigating this known fallibility of perception and memory. That's what much of legal procedure is.
Like cross-examination.
Exactly. The adversarial system itself, cross-examination challenging the witness's account, the use of expert witnesses to talk about factors affecting perception or memory, strict rules against admitting unreliable types of evidence like hearsay, all of this is designed to rigorously test the malleability, the consistency, and the plausibility of any witness's testimony.
Regardless of whether the distortion comes from simple memory contamination, suggestion, or a profound underlying psychotic shift or cognitive hallucination.
Precisely. The system is designed, ideally, to expose the inconsistency or the implausibility of the story being told, not necessarily trying to diagnose the witness or determine the subjective reality of the witness's mental state.
It's focused on the output, the testimony, and whether it fits the legal requirements for evidence.
Correct. So testimony derived from a cognitive hallucination like the flutist's doubling resin and lifespan theory is ultimately rejected by the court. But crucially, it's not rejected because the court somehow metaphysically disproves the delusion. The court can't prove or disprove the shaman's experience of the path as Christ or the flutist's conviction about lifespans.
So why is it rejected?
It's rejected because the testimony fundamentally fails the test of intersubjective agreement under the established procedures.
Intersubjective agreement, meaning it doesn't match the shared consensus reality.
Exactly. It fails to align with the consensual, utilitarian baseline reality that society, by practical necessity, has agreed upon as functionally real and verifiable according to the rules of evidence. The law's judgment remains public, objective in the procedural sense, binding, and backed by the established procedures.
So the court essentially says, implicitly, Your private reality, however powerful and real it feels to you, cannot satisfy our collective procedural need for a shared, physically verifiable account of events that fits within our established rules.
That's a very good summary. The law acknowledges, in a way, that your perception is real to you, but it must prioritize protecting the shared structure, the formal legal truth, that allows millions of us to navigate the same city street, agree on the meaning of a red light, and agree on what a dollar is worth. It represents the ultimate triumph, perhaps, of operational utility over any claim to absolute metaphysical truth.
Okay. Well, so where does this leave us? What does this all mean, pulling it together? We started way down to the microscale, looking at neurochemistry, brain filtering, temporal sampling rates.
Yeah, Huxley's reducing valve, the mechanics of DMT perception.
And we've journeyed all the way up to the macro scale of cultural delusions, engineered realities, and the fundamental operating principles of the legal system. It seems we've demonstrated pretty convincingly that the reality we think we share is actually this carefully negotiated, quite low-resolution projection.
A projection optimized almost purely for biological survival and later social coordination, a definite triumph of operational utility over raw perceptual accuracy.
And we've seen that things like chemical changes, or perhaps pathological states like psychosis, they can effectively tear away those protective layers, reveal the scaffolding, the constructed nature of it all.
Plunging the individual into a state that feels subjectively more intense, maybe even more real, but is fundamentally socially unshared, unvalidated by the consensus.
The core conflict seems crystal clear now. The profound limitations, the malleability, the susceptibility to hallucination within the individual mind. These are disturbingly mirrored, maybe even amplified on the massive scale by things like engineered narratives and collective delusion.
Which just highlights again and again our desperate societal need for shared models of reality, however imperfect they might be. We need that common ground to function.
And this inherent instability, this constant need to update, to patch the gaps in our models of reality, whether personal or societal, it seems to bring us right back to the most foundational layer of knowledge itself, to the inherent limitations of any formal system.
It does. If the brain's predictive model is a formal system, and the law is a formal system, then this whole deep dive strongly suggests that any such formal system, be it our cognitive map of the world, our legal code, maybe even our grandest scientific theories of the universe, will inevitably, necessarily, be incomplete.
Incomplete. And this isn't just a philosophical guess, is it? This resonates deeply with one of the most profound discoveries in logic and mathematics in the 20th century.
You're thinking of Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Exactly. Kurt Gödel's work. Can you remind us of the basic idea?
In essence, Gödel proved, mathematically, that any consistent formal system that is powerful enough to encompass basic arithmetic will inherently contain true statements that cannot be proven within the rules and axioms of that system itself.
So there will always be truths that lie outside the system's ability to formally demonstrate them. Truths beyond proof from within the system.
That's the core implication. And the sources we looked at suggest this isn't some weird flaw or bug in formal systems. Instead, it might be a fundamental feature of reality itself.
A feature? How so?
Well, maybe the brain's predictive model is necessarily incomplete because reality itself is too complex, too dynamic to be fully captured by any static internal model using its own fixed rules. Maybe the law is necessarily incomplete because substantive, lived truth always contains nuances and complexities that procedural rules can't fully encompass.
So this mathematical incompleteness actually reflects the impossibility of any static framework, whether in our heads or in our laws or in our physics, ever fully capturing a reality that is fundamentally dynamic and open-ended.
That's the provocative idea, a reality that's constantly driven by what some thinkers call the universal flux of novelty.
Novelty, meaning the truly new. The unexpected.
Yes. Novelty is the unpredicted, the unprovable within the current system. It's the truth, the pattern, the event that exists outside the system's current ability to define, categorize, or prove it. It's what forces systems to adapt, to grow, to become more complex.
So our entire existence, maybe from our compressed, filtered perception up to our imperfect, evolving laws, is this constant process of striving for more complexity, of trying to incorporate this new information, this novelty, that inevitably breaks the neat boundaries of our previous formal systems.
It's a process of reality constantly outgrowing our attempts to pin it down definitively.
Okay. So we have to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought building on all of this. If reality, the one we perceive and the one we try to legislate, is maybe more like a story that is constantly being written and rewritten.
Oh.
And if the rules of that story, the laws of physics, the laws of society, the boundaries of the possible, the very nature of consensus, are perhaps not as fixed and immutable as they seem.
If they are themselves part of the evolving story.
Then the question becomes, who gets to hold the pen? Who gets to influence the next chapter? And perhaps more personally, what are you going to write? What novelty will you introduce?